No, but it's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Trevor, for coming along here and presenting to us. We will be hearing from you again in August, which is great too. I think Trevor's probably known to many of you as a very inspirational figure in and around our community. And in terms of moral modalities, I think it's one of those things that once the penny drops, you begin to see that it's actually making a contribution that A is much needed, B extremely practical, and C David talked about the beginning about sometimes making you see the world a slightly different way, and I think it's one of those. uh,
Thank you,
thank you so
Peter.
much, Trevor.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Jonathan, I can't share my screen. We tested this, but at the moment,
Yes,
it's not
I know
working.
what I need to do. I'll make you co-host again. So
Yeah.
click that. Yes, yes.
Aha. Excellent.
Can I give you background Screen of the Year award as well, Trevor, on behalf of the society?
Right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Because I'm annoyed because I suddenly can't see any of you, which is really annoying. I've got to move you to a different screen. So apologies for the slightly croaky throat. Now, I don't know. Okay, so just a bit of context here. It's getting on a bit, and I've been in IT now as of January for 50 years, which is quite scary, really. I got into it when it was punch cards and reel-to-reel tapes going round, and it seems to have kind of changed a bit since then. In about the mid-90s, about 1993, I got very frustrated at getting paid lots of money for working on projects that failed. And I thought there must be something we could do about this. And I had a copy of a thing called Platform for Change sitting on my library shelf. And it'd been sitting there since the 1970s or late 70s. I pulled it down and thought, yeah, this guy knows all about this. So I tracked Stafford down about 1993. And I started learning, particularly the viable system model approach. And in 1996, I got the first opportunity to use it in anger on a project to transform the IT for a £2 billion a year turnover organization. And I was amazed at how powerful it was. And 2 years into that project in 1998, a certain young fellow called Peter Kowalik, who was working at Warwick Business School, came to look at what we were doing to assess it in terms of good practice in IT projects. And I'm not going to waste any time explaining it, but the blunt truth was, he took a look at what we were doing. We asked him to benchmark it against other activities in the same domain, which was retailing throughout Europe. And his benchmark suggested that we were outperforming typical IT projects by about 100-fold. Is that not a fair comment, Peter?
I think you had a team of 5 or 7 or something like this.
Yeah, we had 5
instead
people.
of an IT department. It was like
Yeah,
ludicrous.
I know, it was embarrassing. The other thing is that we were actually all working from our homes. This was between 1996 and 1999. So we basically developed an ERP system from scratch, writing everything from first principles in 3 years, and with a team of 5 people. And I thought, this is great. So, but what I became aware of is it is great, but there are social tripwires that trip up the ability to operate and use the viable system model. So I got very interested in the psychology, the social psychology of that. And I wrote a paper for Stafford's Festschrift. I presented it and wrote the paper for the collection in 2003 called Viability versus Tribalism, which was an early attempt to look at these questions about what is it about our organizations that is resistant to actually making them more viable? Because this is a very difficult, this is not a simple matter to deal with. And then in about 2014, having been using the viable system model at that time as a practitioner, I woke up one morning with this idea about moral modalities. And it is basically, excuse me, my voice is playing up something rotten. It's basically a 5-dimensional recursive moral philosophy grounded in Stafford's viable system model. And I teach it, I haven't been running around sort of screaming about it. I teach it as part of a one-day crash course, which I call How Organizations Really Work, usually to select small groups of people, particularly people in startup situations. It's a one-day crash course. Half the day is VSM, the other half is this moral modalities framework. And some people just don't come back. Some people apply it and get embarrassingly powerful results. And then it's my way of saying, this is out there, and if you're interested in it, I will mentor you in this, and we will form a kind of value proposition where I get some kind of reward that is aligned with the value that gets generated as a result of you applying this. But I think the time has come, having been applying this. I think I presented it in 2015 at the Metaforum conference in Hull, but I have not been sort of doing academic papers about it. It's basically for practicing and getting organizations off the ground, as well as diagnosing issues with them, to add another dimension to Stafford's work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to gallop through this spreadsheet-like thing. Oh, it didn't actually work. I tried to change to the next. Oh, no, here we go. Sorry, pressed the wrong button. So it's a multi-dimensional moral philosophy compliant with the viable system model. So if we look at this diagram first, let's just take you through it. So in terms of the diagram, the columns are these different moral modalities, which I contend we all operate all the time in our lives, and we flip between them if we're skilled, and we're doing it all the time without even noticing we're doing it. If you become aware that you're doing it, you can be more productive in terms of using the right one to get the right result. In terms of the rows, these are levels of recursion in life. And this diagram represents the typical way that we work in what we would call a developed society. And actually, I've done quite a lot of work on the history of this and why other cultures don't operate this way and how it evolved. But we haven't got time to talk about that. So basically, these are the modalities. They are called unconditional care, guardianship, conditioned hierarchy, exchange, and learning network. And I will just take you through the levels of recursion that I think are relevant. So the levels of recursion I'm looking at are the sphere of personal relationships, the sphere of being at work, which does take up quite a lot of our lives, and also the sphere of public affairs. So if you look at the unconditional care modality, this is the one where people do things for each other because it's the human thing to do. Somebody needs something. As a human being, you recognize you can help, and you get stuck in and do it without any consideration of whether you will either get rewarded for it or maybe even see that person again. So at the personal level, if we think about cultures up until actually probably the 1950s even here. I'm looking at it through the lens of 5,000 years of traditional culture in terms of having gendered relations to these things. But I'm not saying they have to be gendered. So I do get attacked by feminists every now and again for this bit, but it's not intended to be gender specific, apart from the fact that for most people up until quite recently it has been. So in the personal sphere, this is about motherhood and love, like, you know, bringing up your kids. Human beings are the most helpless beings on the planet when they're born. If they don't get unconditional care, they don't survive, and they certainly don't thrive. So it's about motherhood and love, about unconditionally looking after your babies, your kids, and so on. At the work level, it's about doing creative things above and beyond what you get rewarded for. Just because you don't want to be enslaved to this thing. You want to humanize the thing. Let's be creative. Let's invent stuff. Let's do stuff that is beyond just what I get paid for. Beyond my pay grade, all that kind of stuff. I won't talk about the skunkworks thing, we haven't got time. But it's about individual creativity and also forming dynamic groups that can be creative as well. In the public sphere, which is quite a new idea that comes out of probably after the Second World War in the UK, is the idea that the public sphere takes responsibility for providing emergency services and also for supporting people who cannot support themselves. So we're talking about things like the NHS and social care, the fire brigade, mountain rescue, all that kind of stuff. So that's unconditional care. That's one of those modalities that we operate in. The second one I call guardianship. And this is around who are we? What is the difference between being inside this particular social context, organization, whatever it is, and what's outside? It's about saying, where's the boundary that makes us who we are? So it's about the value system. It's about what's our value system. If people are not following this value system, they're not inside this thing. They're outside. And traditionally, that was the role of the father in the family. Boy, you don't do that kind of thing in this family, and you get a clip around the ear if you misbehave. In the work environment, it's about the responsibilities of the chair and non-exec directors of the organization to oversee the fact that the executives don't step outside the bounds of the value system of the organization. And in the public sphere, it gets quite mysterious because it is about who are we, what are our values as a nation state? What does it mean to be Russian, or what does it mean to be English or British or Scottish or whatever? And it's the domain of religions, monarchies, presidency. It's also about protecting the boundaries, which is the defense business, the business of defending the actual territorial domain. So that's guardianship. The conditioned hierarchy one is the one that is about being an appropriately socially compliant person, not necessarily by reflection, but by being inducted into a social value system by punishment if you don't behave and reward if you do. So it's about having a kind of career path, a greasy pole to climb, and also keeping on keeping on. So it's about executive power. It's about social status, that kind of stuff. So a chap called Eric Byrne wrote a book called Games People Play back in the 60s, and he founded something called transactional analysis, which is a therapeutic approach to analysing what happens to children if they're in an authoritarian family environment, which is not meeting their needs, and what kind of tricks they play to try and get their needs met, needs for attention, all that kind of stuff. So it's really about authoritarian bringing people. It's about things like shut up and don't ask questions. Do what you're told, because that's the only way. Just do what you're told. Don't question. In the work environment, it is about I'm the boss, you're the subordinate. I tell you what to do and you do it. You don't have to understand it. Just shut up and get on with it, which we consider to be bullying these days, but it used to be, quite normal. It was just a normal thing. These days, we think it's unacceptable, but that's quite a major cultural change. In the public sphere, it is about slavishly following a leader. Dare I think of what I saw on the television at Donald Trump's inauguration ceremony, whatever. People in tears and all this kind of stuff. So it's about you're the leader, I follow. I kind of almost like a kind of worship, obedience to tradition, like caste systems and traditional aristocratic hierarchies. But it's also about the rule of law, that you get inculcated into following the rule of law without thinking about it. But it's also the mechanism that marketing men use to persuade you to get their product. So it's about things like, I want to get a BMW because it will be high status when people see I'm driving one, that kind of stuff which marketing men play on. The next one is exchange modality, which is about how do we operate with respect to our peers, the people that are on the same level as we are. It's not about any exertion of power. It's about I've got certain things you would want, you've got certain things I would want. Let's do a deal. Let's negotiate deals. Let's figure out a modus vivendi without wielding power over each other. So it's about modern parenthood negotiating who does the washing up and the hoovering and stuff instead of it being just assumed. It's about how siblings get on or don't, about trying to sort of get on with those siblings you're growing up with. It's about how you get on with your mates, how what happens when you go down the pub and what happens if somebody doesn't buy a round. But hopefully they do voluntarily. So at work, it's about your relationship with people, your peer group, at a particular level of the thing. And in commerce, it's about the idea of free market competition, which is much less common than we would hope, I think. The last one I call learning networks. And this is different to this conditioned hierarchy where there is a hierarchy that you don't question. There are people with prestige just because they've got prestige, because they've climbed the thing and they've got prestige. They are the master of Balliol College. I am the master of Balliol College. Anything I don't know isn't knowledge kind of stuff. But in learning networks, the authority flows depending on who knows. So if somebody knows more than you do, and you're in this learning network dynamic, you subordinate yourself to listen to them to learn it. But once you've learned that thing, the authority relationship dissolves because they are no longer an authority figure. They're on the same level as you are. So it's very fluid. It's about the kind of nurturing form of parent-child relationships, learning from each other. At work, it's about mentoring, the idea of management as a service to those being managed, and about apprenticeships, mentoring, and that kind of stuff. In the public sphere, it's the idea that there's a public obligation to provide education so that people can be active citizens. participating in the future of the community and participating in political decision making and such like things. So if you look at that diagram, it's embarrassingly simple. Some people say it's really boring because it looks like a spreadsheet, but there's a lot of content in this. You'll note that as we move up here, we're moving from the private, less rule-bound domain into a public sphere, which is more rule-bound, and it goes from being about personal relationships to more legalistic stuff as you move up the hierarchy. Has anybody got any instant questions to just before I move on? I know we haven't got much time. Okay, so next thing to look at is, I've said it's a multidimensional moral philosophy compliant with the VSN. So let's take a look at that through the lens of the viable system model. So unconditional care is system one stuff, the stuff that without doubt there isn't anything there. It's also about the algedonic signaling of if there is an emergency, the normal procedures fly out the window, everybody wakes up to deal with it. The guardianship modality is system 5 ethos and policy. The conditioned hierarchy is the relationship between system 1 and system 3 in the VSM, where system 3 is the cohesion level, but it works partly by a resource bargain with the system 1. In other words, system 3 says, here are some resources. I'm offering you resources to be part of my cunning plan, to join my cunning plan instead of just carrying on with your cunning plan. But in exchange, I want you to account to show that you've actually done what we agreed. And the problem for human beings, I would contend, is that they tend to get stuck in, because this is the drivers of hopes and fears, they tend to get trapped in thinking this is reality rather than being a social construct. So we tend to get hypnotized into compliance with these conditioned hierarchies. And the exchange system is system 2 coordination activities. And finally, the learning network is the organ of evolution. It's system 4 intelligence. Now, the point about uncovering this stuff is that viable system model is kind of like physics. It's like kind of almost the kind of Newtonian physics of organization, but it's kind of bloodless. It doesn't give you a kind of sense of the nitty-gritty of what it is to be in these things and how you need to conduct yourself appropriately for these different, to fulfill these different functions. So this is about what it feels like to be human when you're doing these things. So I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this, but I'm going to take you through how these emerge in the sport of tennis. And it works in any other sport, but we'll do tennis. So the guardianship modality is, how do we know whether we're playing tennis or not? And that is the Lawn Tennis Association at Wimbledon that oversees what the rules are. And if you don't follow their rules, you're not playing lawn tennis, you're doing something else. And that's fine. You might invent paddleboard or whatever it's called, or paddle or whatever, some other game, but you're no longer doing lawn tennis. The conditioned hierarchy is the kind of tribal sense of being the fan of a particular player. Like I love Rafael Nadal and I hate Andy Murray or Novak Djokovic. It's that kind of sense of being in it because there's an emotional thing, a passion through it. It kind of drives passions, like being in a tribe. And it's not surprising that the word fan is an abbreviation for fanatic. So it got that passionate aspect that makes you want to be in it. The exchange modality is umpiring to make sure that in real time in action, the rules are being followed. And it's interesting to reflect that the System 2 coordination activity is actually the guardianship activity on the ground, making sure that you're inside the bounds. So System 2 coordination is about, are you doing this right or are you cheating? The umpiring. The learning network is sports science. It's like somebody invents carbon fibers and puts them in a tennis racket. Is that allowed in the rules? We have to evolve the rules in accordance with the evolution of new technologies, new coaching methods, all that kind of stuff. I read today, only today actually, that the Wimbledon is doing e-tennis competitions next year. So that is an example of the learning network going, oh, there are e-games. There's an e version of playing. So why don't we do that as part of Wimbledon? And they are going to do it next year. Okay, so, and then the unconditional care modality is people who have served sport and tennis and been members of the community who can no longer look after themselves. We have charitable activities to look after. We also have charitable activities to encourage people to join the sport. So there are the modalities in the sport of tennis. I'm just going to finish off here by talking about a wonderful expression that was coined by a brilliant lady called Jane Jacobs, who's mostly known as a town planner, but she wrote a book called Systems of Survival, which is a fantastic Socratic dialogue set in Toronto. And apparently Stafford and Elena apparently knew Jane Jacobs because she used to use the same convenience store in Toronto. So she's known as the town planner that transformed town planning to stop Robert Moses putting motorways through Greenwich Village in New York. She left USA because she didn't want her son to be drafted into the Vietnam War and became a citizen of Canada and lived in Toronto. But she came up with this idea of monstrous moral hybrids are what you get when you think you're doing one of these modalities, but actually you're using another one illegitimately. I like the mafia. The mafia protection rackets in Toronto wiped out the textile industry. It just left. It's about the confusion between these modalities leading to monstrous moral hybrids. And I questioned, when I wrote this, it was before the Qatar World Cup, but it was a question of how did the Qataris manage to get the World Cup to take place in Qatar, where the summertime temperature in the shade is about 40 degrees centigrade? And the answer is, to be quite blunt, they just bribed everybody, including people like Sepp Blatter of FIFA, who managed never to get prosecuted for it. So that's an example of a monstrous moral hybrid, where you're supposed to be the guardian overseeing the value system and without fear of favor to any particular party who wants to host the World Cup. But you allow that not to happen. It's about conflicts of interest. And I also remember in Formula One group, Bernie Ecclestone did some naughty things. So that's it. That's the framework. So have we got time for some questions?
Yeah, got a good 10 minutes or so. So yeah,
great.
Thank you, Trevor. Right. Anybody?
Sorry about the croaky voice.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That was really good, Trevor. So, David, I think you've got your hand raised.
Yeah. So if you're in the organization, maybe at the top of it, and somebody asks you to do something useful but on questionable moral, value. How do you engage with this, really interesting diagram? What do you say? Or
Well,
think?
what I would say, I mean, for example, I would say that particularly the tech industry is absolutely plagued with monstrous moral hybrids, caused by the fact that organizations seem to have forgotten what purpose they're supposed to be pursuing and allowed that purpose to collapse into our job is to make the share price go up, bluntly, by whatever means is appropriate. Now, I would say that that is a massive dereliction of responsibility, and it should actually be examined very closely. But unfortunately, it isn't, because there's been a considerable amount of what I would call regulatory capture, where these organizations have become so powerful that they're not operating within a regulatory framework that can control that, and also they're not being called to account. The executives are not being called to account by non-execs about, hang on, have you forgotten what the purpose of this organization is?
Yeah. So
does that help? Go on.
well, so if somebody asks you to do something which is a little bit dodgy, can you refer back to this and say no in a way which rationalizes it, in a way which is not written off by your deputies or whoever as just a little bit airy-fairy and flimsy and over-idealistic?
Well, I mean, the answer to that is that you have to look at, I mean, one of the most powerful ideas, I think, in cybernetics is purpose of a system is what it does, which is basically saying, if people espouse a purpose, you need to look at the feedback loops that are in place that they're paying attention to see whether they are assessing whether that purpose is being fulfilled or not. If you can't find those, you've basically got an organization that is riddled with conflicts of interest.
I mean, linking the individual and the institution, finding selfish reasons for being good, I don't know, maybe it's part of our moral education. I don't know. Otherwise, you have to create heaven and, a later payoff, but
I mean, to me, the way that you manage these things is by going back and going, hang on, what purpose did we say we were here for? Like, Google, do no evil. What happened to that? It's not a very good purpose because it doesn't really mean much, but it was something. And a lot of people, well, they basically kind of scrapped it at a certain point in Google's career. So I would say that funny enough, there is a very good book that's just been published by Dan Davis called The Unaccountability Machine, which have got a very good review in Bloomberg and all over the place. Yes,
can you see
it's actually very, very good, because it's actually about the fact that it's so difficult to get organizations to be accountable. They just don't seem to think that they need to be accountable for what they're doing. And why is that? Using the VSM as a lens.
Could I contribute another example, Jonathan? Is that okay?
Yeah, and then after you, Peter, we'll go to Fabian and then Michael.
Sorry if I'm booking the order, but I was just thinking of nature and rivers, perhaps that care for rivers might be something that we intuit as unconditional care, but is transformed into a monstrous moral hybrid through exchange and conditioned hierarchy, as an example, with the results that we've had lately.
Ecuador has just got a legal case for the rights of the river that runs through the capital, Quito, and they just made a legal case that its rights are being violated by abuse of the river.
Yeah, exactly. So, and recently in the UK, I think there's a kind of a general comment about how much of sort of modern life, I'm probably not expressing that very well, but there has been a kind of movement to try and express almost everything in terms of columns 3 and 4. Um, and therefore, what this framework is exposing is how society in recent decades has tried to compress itself into 3 and 4, and then to put less emphasis, less teaching, less value around other vital parts of viability. But let me not hog it. But I think Riv is a good example.
Right, thank you.
Fabian, then I think.
Yeah, I found that interesting. I find with the question of hybridity, it seems that that the framework you've got, the moral modalities, different people might have constructed those their frameworks which they see themselves acting in quite differently. If you look at the transformation of Northern Ireland, some of the people, the guardianship, they did not see as resting in the monarchy.
Yeah.
And they also found themselves discriminated against on the basis of religion. So hybridity happens when people aren't clear about their modalities. And in fact, people might discover when they look into those modalities, they have different tensions between them.
Yeah, absolutely.
To see how that hybridity relates to the emergence of conflict.
Yep.
So that's the way that the analysis can be developed, I feel. Interesting.
Oh yeah, I mean, when I do this thing in how organizations really work, I spend, depending on how many questions you get, 2 or 3 hours on it. And I do actually go through its application to the domain, for example, of how scientific paradigms unfold, the history of religions and all sorts of other human activities, because this stuff works at any level of recursion from the individual upwards, because after all it would, wouldn't it? Because it's based on the viable system model. And once you start to see it in action, it's just everywhere. So most front page newspaper headlines, if you look at them, they are flagging up some kind of monstrous moral hybrid situation and causing a kicking up about it without necessarily diagnosing it in that way.
Michael, do you want to go next?
Let me just put my hand down. So, yeah, funny you should mention Northern Ireland. I was just 2 nights ago, in fact, having a long one-to-one discussion with someone who'd been in prison for 12 years in the maze, involved in the blanket protests and so on in the early 80s. He's now an artist. But it did strike me in the conversation how nuanced he was in particular, and how non-fundamentalist it all seems in some ways in the north of Ireland now, or in the 6 counties. So it's interesting to consider kind of queer overlaps with these. I mean, I found the presentation really interesting and provocative. I mean, and it escapes, I mean, typically people talk about public and private, but you've put work in the middle. So that's one thing I find really intriguing, how important something like the word work might be, especially in a world where people are talking about universal basic incomes, etc., etc. It still seems to have traction. It seems like an old-fashioned term in that in Western countries we're sort of told work should be fun, when people demand the right to work and people's. But a second question was simply to do with that overlapping. I mean, there seems to be a lot of psychotherapeutic language here, if I'm right, and stuff to do with pedagogy and education as well. But there's a sense in this of transactionalism as well, of give and take. So who's to say that when I'm a father or a mother, or I've got friends, that I'm not having pleasure from giving?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I don't even want to suggest that that's a transaction. You know, there is kind of both in one, if you see what I mean. taking care of
absolutely.
someone whilst they die, for example,
Yeah.
could be the most enriching human experience. So how does the model deal with the idea of the complexities of pleasure? And I wanted to ask you lastly, this is too much for now, for sure. You know, a real kind of democracy, where would that fit in here, as opposed to the lip service idea or the word democracy, but actual participatory democracy? Does it have a place in this diagram? And you probably say, obviously it does, but yeah.
Well, yeah, it does. I mean, yeah, the thing about this is that my contention, and again, I see this as being a much more subtle approach to thinking about more issues than most of the moral philosophy we've inherited from the so-called Enlightenment in the 18th century, which I've always found to be immensely implausible and doesn't seem to describe real human beings at all, largely because it's obsessed with rationality. So what I would say is, and when I do a proper presentation, I can't make this point, is that to be a fully rounded human being is to kind of navigate these cells in this diagram in a very fluid way and know which you are doing and flow between them without being stuck in any of them. We tend to get trapped in a particular one, and then we don't know how to get out of it. I mean, the classic one is if you're trapped in a conditioned hierarchy, it's powerful and it looks like it's real. And if somebody from the learning network modality comes along with a new idea, the classic diagnostic that you're stuck in the conditioned hierarchy is when you say, well, that wouldn't happen in the real, that wouldn't work in the real world. In other words, when you hear somebody say that, it's almost a diagnostic that they've trapped themselves in a vision of the world which they think is real because it's powerfully emotive and powerfully attached to their emotional hopes and fears. And it's almost a kind of diagnostic. If we can help people to recognize when they're stuck in that and get into this learning network modality, they can evolve and get out of being just stuck in a particular assumption set. So I think it's about, there is a lot of, it should be fluid. The other thing is, of course, as with the viable system model, the system in focus doesn't have to be static. You shift your attention to different systems in focus, and it should be very, very fluid as a process. So really, this is about a dexterity in being more human and recognizing when you are doing these things. And obviously, one of the most powerful kind of solvents for being trapped is the sense of humor. The sense of humor is very diagnostic of getting out of these traps. And of course, it gets punished by people who are trapped in them. They don't like humor because it threatens their power structure. So yeah, that's anyway. Thanks for listening. Thanks for giving me some time. Angus Jenkins and I are going to be doing a session using this again. When is it? 13th of August?
Yeah, Wednesday the 13th of August.
Yes. So Angus can be talking about regeneration and why people don't seem to be able to do it. And I'm going to be using this framework to analyze some of the barriers to that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Trevor. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, we'll look forward to the session on the 13th of August.